CSIS. And now your host, international business lawyer, David Day.
Well, good afternoon, and as the announcer said, welcome to Pacific Forum's Issues and Insights. We're going to be talking about Japan this afternoon, and the topic of our show is Abe's Tailwind and the end of the twisted diet for Japan. And as many of you know, there was a rather remarkable election in Japan that occurred just a few days ago, and to help us with an understanding of the ramifications of that election and where Japan is headed in a whole host of areas is an adjunct fellow for the Center for International Strategic Studies in Washington, and also a professor with the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, Mr. Jeffrey Hornung. And Jeffrey, wonderful to have you here, and thank you for taking time out of your busy life to come downtown here and be with us.
Thank you for having me.
Just to kind of set the stage for this discussion, Jeffrey, for our audience, I think that many of the folks out there, they know that Prime Minister Abe and Abenomics received some kind of a vote of confidence in a recent election. And I guess, you know, in the big picture that we want to get at maybe later on in the show that I like people to think about is that, you know, Japan has had kind of this leadership desert or a revolving prime minister door for many years, and maybe we're at the end with a new strong leader coming up. I don't know the answer to that. And,
yeah, I think that's a good point. If you look at the last 20 years in Japan, really after the Cold War, other than about 5-year period in the early 2000s, Japanese leaders have pretty much revolved every year.
Every year?
Pretty much every year. There's been a couple in there. In the mid-90s, there was one gentleman for 3 months. But if you look at it, it's really been every year, and since 2006, it has been yearly.
You know, for us to go back and see a stable, lengthy leadership in Japan, we have to go back to the Koizumi era, don't we?
Yes. You have to go back to the Koizumi era, and before that, you have to dig way back to the 1980s to the Nakasone era.
And Koizumi is the mid?
Koizumi is from 2000 to 2006.
Okay. So Japan has actually been almost, figuratively speaking, leaderless for
Yes.
a period of time here.
Yes, they've suffered from this leadership deficit, and so these rotations of prime ministers has been the norm, as opposed to stability, where you can count on an administration lasting for more than 1 year.
Jeffrey, what's the impact of this revolving door leadership, just on the broad, big picture upon Japan over the last years? What's been the impact of this?
Well, the biggest impact, of course, is when you look at a prime minister, if he's only in power for a year, and of course he doesn't plan on only being in power for a year.
I understand.
But it's very difficult to advance an agenda, because as soon as he gets in, as soon as popularity starts to sink, he's in it to try to political survival, to try to protect his administration. And so while you might have some prime ministers that try to make some start in the first couple months of their administration, as soon as they start coming under attack, their political agenda goes out the window, which actually, if you look at the last 20 years, that's why you see very few initiatives by Japan domestically.
Well, the last 20 years, and actually there's a few more on top of that 20. We have to actually reach back to about the time of the first Gulf War, or slightly before then, I guess in 1990, something like that, is when the end of Japan's great bubble economy collapsed. Right. And from that time forward, there is this concept that we've heard a number of times called the lost generation or the lost generations. And what's that all about?
Well, what you see is that up until the bubble economy, really to the late 1980s, and then in early 1990s when the bubble economy crashed, and Japan has had basically a stagnant economy. If you look at it in absolute terms, it's been relatively flat. It hasn't grown a lot. And so you have a 20-year time period in which the economy has been flat. You've actually had deflation. There hasn't been a lot of job prospects, and so the younger generation that's coming up today, they don't have a positive future. They don't have many job opportunities to look forward to.
Boy, it's been a real quagmire for Japan even before these the economic side, even before the twin dragons of the whole Great Tohoku earthquake
Right.
and the whole deterioration of the relationship with China hit, I guess.
Yeah, there's been a lot of stuff that has not been good for Japan. Let's put it that way. There's just been a lot of bad news, and then when you look at 2011 with the Great East Japan earthquake, and you look at the deterioration of relations with China, there has not been a lot of positive news for Japan in recent times.
So in fact, they have slid, have they not, in terms of at one time the Japanese economy was the second largest in the world, right behind the United States.
That's correct. Up until, I believe, 2 or 3 years ago, Japan was the second largest economy, and then China overtook Japan for the number 2 spot.
And I have seen many references in the media that, and I've seen this with my own eyes in Japan, that for the last several years, you know, the references to Japan as kind of a has-been culture, a has-been economy. They're at third place. They're going to slide even further down. They're never going to recover. They can't restore their energy. This Fukushima was too much for them. The nuclear power imploded, and they've had this revolving door leadership. And so, are we going to see some changes, you think?
I do. I think we will see changes, not just because of the new administration, but because there is a new optimism within the country. There's more positive outlooks amongst the people. But we also shouldn't forget that even though, for instance, the economy has been not doing that great, the per capita income, individual Japanese are still very wealthy. And so they're still enjoying a very good lifestyle, even though the economy as a whole is not performing that great.
What does that mean? They've got money in their pocket, they've got savings, but no hope and no future.
Well, in many ways,
Something like that.
In many ways, that's correct. But for a lot of outsiders, we focus on the GDP, we focus on the big number. That
Okay.
This is not China overtook it. That Japan fell to number 3. But for the individual Japanese, they're not necessarily focusing on that big number. They're focusing on their own lifestyles. And individual Japanese per capita is pretty good. So they're not feeling the pinch that other countries maybe would feel if their economies start to falter.
Let's shift a little bit now, Jeffrey, to kind of a focus on the significance and what is this Abe victory politically? What happened here?
Well, what you see is that the Abe victory this past weekend, Japan has 2 houses of parliament. They have a House of Representatives, which is similar to the U.S. House of Representatives.
Okay.
And then they have a House of Councilors, which is similar to the U.S. Senate. So and they're called the lower house and the upper house. The election this past weekend was for the House of Councilors. It's the less powerful house. But what it did was you ended a situation in Japan that was referred to as the twisted diet.
And what does that mean?
Well, the diet in Japan is actually the name for the Japanese parliament. And so by ending the twisted diet from 2007, the coalition that was in government, the administration that held power in the lower house, which is the more
Okay.
powerful house, did not hold the majority in the upper house. And so the parties in the upper house were able to frustrate government policy bills that they were trying to pass. So since 2007, you've had really gridlock. Nothing has been able to pass.
Gee, that sounds very familiar, doesn't it?
It does sound very familiar.
Twisted Congress, something like that.
But the big difference is that in December of last year, the Liberal Democratic Party, which is the current Prime Minister's party, he won a huge victory, gained a majority in the lower house, became Prime Minister, and this past weekend, his party had a big victory in the upper house. So now, for the first time since 2007, you have the same party holding the reins of power in both houses.
Okay, and so there is the potential with this LDP party control in both houses of the Diet that Abe can advance an agenda.
Yes, that is correct.
And he is set as a leader for how long now?
Constitutionally, he does not have to call an election until 2016.
So he is in a comfort position to make some significant changes in Japan if he can enforce the party discipline to make it happen.
That's the key. As long as his party does not try to take him down from within, basically as long as he maintains popularity within his party, he has the ability to pass policies that he wishes.
Okay, and within that LDP party, or that coalition, there are a couple of interesting factions or groups, aren't there?
There are. In the past, the LDP was really, it's called a sort of a big tent party. You have a bunch of essentially smaller parties that make up the big party. And these smaller parties, they're factions. They're basically around a popular or a very strong political personality. Now, in the past, these factions were incredibly significant, incredibly influential. But today, they're not. And so today, you have a party that does have factions, but you have a lot of divisions that exist, and the factions are not able to exert the discipline that they once were.
So, as an example, one of those factions would be the rural rice farmers.
Right.
And we'll explore more of what's going to happen with Japan after the break. So stay with us. listening to Pacific Forum's Issues and Insights. Our guest today is Dr. Jeffrey Hornung, And Jeffrey is an adjunct fellow with the Office of the Japan Chair for the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., which is associated, affiliated, or somehow connected with our beloved Pacific Forum here in Honolulu. And Jeffrey is also a professor, Dr. Jeffrey Hornung, at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, and we're talking about the Abe tailwind as a consequence of the recent elections in Japan. And you can join our conversation by calling us at area code 808-296-5467. That's area code 808-296-5467. And Jeffrey, at the break, we were talking about the Abe victory and take kind of a quick overview of what this majority party now in both houses of the Japanese Diet is composed of. And we mentioned about, I use the word faction, maybe that's not correct, but what about this agrarian rice farmer constituency of the LDP party? I mean, do they really kind of fit with the modern day Japan?
Well, the agrarian voters have really been the bread and butter for the LDP since their founding. And within the party itself, you have a very strong, basically lobbyists that represent the elected officials that represent these agrarian voters. And so they're extremely powerful in swaying the LDP as well as getting them elected. Now,
Prime Minister Abe has been a prime minister before.
Yes.
So this is, this is his second chance. And one of the things that he did before, as I recall, was, he had a very a right-leaning, hawkish, very conservative approach that even included, I think, a connection with or visit to the infamous Yasukuni Shrine.
Right.
Am I correct?
Yeah, he's a known conservative. People call him a right-winger or a hawk. I mean, there's many names that people do call him. But when he was previously prime minister, he really pushed what many see as sort of a nationalist agenda. One of the big things was he was pushing patriotic education. And in many ways, the voters in Japan don't have a stomach for a lot of those things that he was pushing. They were focusing on more of the economy. And so because Abe focused so much on that nationalist agenda in his previous time as prime minister, he only lasted for a year, and he bowed out after, due to scandals and other things, he bowed out after a year.
So possibility that he's learned his lesson?
Oh, no doubt. I mean, everybody in Japan sees Abe as sort of being lost in the wilderness. He learned his lessons from his previous stint as prime minister, and now he's back and he's focusing specifically on economic policies first. He's really seen as a pragmatic guy this time around.
Well, we'll get to economic policy in just 1 second. I just wanted to ask you about you have this very conservative, right-leaning prime minister that is, however you define the term, at least he's a partial hawk. And then within the coalition of the LDP, there's this New Komeito party or group, which is a pacifist organization, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Yeah, you have the ruling party right now is made up of the Liberal Democratic Party, which is Abe's party, and the New Komeito, which is this Buddhist pacifist party you talked about. And they've linked up since the late 1990s. They've been a coalition government before. A lot of this now is institutional. A lot of it is also because the New Komeito, they like governing. They like the taste of power. And so sometimes they do sacrifice their principles for the sake of remaining in government.
Okay.
The perfect case of this is in 2003 when Japan decided to deploy forces to Iraq for humanitarian and reconstruction efforts. New Komeito was against it, but they swallowed their principles in many ways and allowed that to go forward.
On the economic side, the new Abe. A lot of talk about Abenomics and these things called the 3 arrows.
Right.
So, help me and help our audience. Well, why do they call them arrows?
Well, they're 3 arrows because they're essentially meant to be shot and targeted at specific issues. And so he calls them three arrows, and the media loves it. It's very easy for people to understand three arrows.
It relates back to the old samurai movies, something like that?
It could. I mean, there is the saying that one arrow breaks easily, but three arrows together don't break. And so by launching three arrows together, which is Abenomics, it's hopefully that this is going to be strength in numbers.
Okay, first arrow?
But, well, the three arrows are, one is monetary easing, essentially a lot of just pouring money, the Bank of Japan pouring money into the economy. Two is fiscal spending, the government basically getting a lot of...
Priming the pump?
Priming the pump. A lot of this is public work spending.
Okay.
And then the third, and this is what many people see as the most important, it's structural reforms.
Structural reforms.
Structural reforms are things in the Japanese economy that have been viewed as holding the Japanese economy back.
Like what?
Well, for instance, the agriculture industry. The agricultural lobby has...
their own political base has been holding the country back.
They have prevented Japan from liberalizing in many ways. For instance, the rice imports, rice exports. So Japan has huge tariffs on rice. And so if you're, for instance, an American exporter of rice trying to get into the Japanese market, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And so you have these three arrows that Abe is promoting. The first two have really already been launched, the fiscal spending and the monetary easing. It's the structural reforms that he's announced some issues, but we're really still waiting for some real meat to be put on those bones.
Okay, so the key for the success for Abenomics is to make this, because he's had, the first two arrows have stuck, have they not?
So far, if you look at the Nikkei, the stock index, if you look at just the movement of the yen, it seems that a lot of this, there's been a lot of fluctuations, but it seems that a lot of this is trending in an upward direction.
And so the real focus, the issue that we need to follow in the months ahead is this third arrow, the structural reform, if this one is going to stick.
Right. That's the key, because that's going to lead to the long-term viability of or the success of the Japanese economy. And so we're looking really here at things like, is there going to be a large influx of women in the Japanese workforce? Are they going to allow immigrants, a large influx of immigrants? Is there going to be a dedication of resources to innovation? There's a host of issues. Tackling the agricultural lobby is one of the big ones, and that gets tied into the whole Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations.
We'll come back to that in a moment, but I think this is you've given a really excellent overview of what kinds of issues are encompassed by this third arrow of structural reform, and clearly, if you look at the way Japan has been operating as a country, as an economy, it's fabulous success. People often say that they've been able to do this by only operating at half throttle, because they haven't ever really taken advantage of the women in their country yet.
Right, and Abe did mention a couple weeks ago, he mentioned that he wants to, I forget the time date, but he wants to make a zero waiting line for women with children, putting children into daycare centers. Right now there's long waiting lists at many of these daycare centers. He wants to make a zero list so that women can go back to work. But it wasn't received that well, because it was just sort of seen as that's more of a symptom, not a cause, that you really have to provide an environment for women to be to have upward mobility in the workforce, or lateral entry, not just providing them daycare centers for children.
There's a little bit more to it than
There's more to it than
daycare centers. Any discussion within the senior leadership in Japan, the impact of looking over at a competitive country in South Korea and seeing Madam Park rise to the level of president of the country, Korean lady running the show?
There has been some talk, not maybe to the level that maybe some would expect. Within the Liberal Democratic Party, there is one lady, Koike Yuriko, that many people think that if Japan is to have a female prime minister, she would be the one. But at this point, I think that's still many years from now.
Okay. One of the issues that Prime Minister Abe has been talking about is constitutional revision.
Yes.
And what is his proposal? What is he referring to there?
Well, Japan, the Constitution of Japan was written by the U.S. during the occupation back after World War II. And the Constitution has not been revised since. And so the Constitution was actually written in English and translated into Japanese. And so from the Japanese perspective, this is not an original document. This is not something that has Japanese fingerprints on it, so to say.
It has Douglas MacArthur's
It has
fingerprints.
MacArthur's fingerprints all over it. And so there's an element, there's basically a push to not just make the document a Japanese document, but to actually change it to adapt to the times, which is what amendments do for constitutions.
Okay, and one of the amendments that I've heard talk about has to do with Japan's military or self-defense forces. And when we come back after the break, let's talk about that, because that changes kind of the posture of Japan in the Asia-Pacific region, does it not?
Yes.
So ladies and gentlemen, we'll be back. We'll see you on the other side of the break. You are listening to Pacific Forum's Issues and Insights, and you may be watching Pacific Forum's Issues and Insights, because ThinkTech does bring its shows to you streaming live on the internet. And you can pick that up at those shows up, the links up at our website at thinktechhawaii.com. Our guest today is Dr. Jeffrey Hornung, a professor at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies and also an adjunct fellow at the Office of the Japan Chair for the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., which is affiliated with our own Pacific Forum here in Honolulu. And you can join the conversation by calling us at area code 808-296-5467. And Jeffrey, right at the break there, we were talking about making Japan's constitution that dates back to World War II Japanese instead of a product of the Douglas MacArthur era. And let's focus on this Article 9 for a moment here. What are the reinterpretation or revisions? What's Article 9 all about, first of all?
Well, Article 9 is essentially 2 paragraphs in the Japanese Constitution that gets a lot of attention. And the gist of it is, 1, it says that Japan will not maintain forces and that Japan will not be belligerent. And so this is the root of why people call the Japanese Constitution the pacifist constitution.
All right. And so is there talk of changing this out completely?
Well, not necessarily completely, but as many people know, Japan today has one of the largest militaries in the world. And if you think about what's written in the Constitution and the fact that it has one of the largest militaries in the world, reality doesn't match what's on the document. And so what Abe and the LDP have been wanting to do for a while is basically amend Article 9 to give legal standing to Japan's military, which is called the Self-Defense Forces. And at the same time, they also want to change the name of the Self-Defense Forces to the National Defense Force, although the Japanese character for force is actually military, so it would be the National Defense Military.
Is this drive to amend Article 9, is this somehow tied into the Senkaku dispute with China?
The revision of the Constitution, I would argue, is not tied in with the Senkaku dispute, but the reinterpretation of the Constitution is. And the reinterpretation is different from the revision of the Constitution.
Oh, you lost me. You'll have to explain that.
Okay. Well, right now, a lot of discussion is on revising the Constitution, which is what I said about changing the name of the military. Okay. But reinterpretation of the Constitution, right now, Japan has an interpretation that it has the right to self-defense if it's attacked.
Okay.
It also has the right to collective self-defense, although it does not exercise that right. So, and collective self-defense means essentially that as Japan and the U.S. as an ally, if the U.S. comes under attack, Japan right now cannot help the U.S. if it comes under attack.
Interesting. It's a one-way street.
It's a one-way street. And so the reinterpretation of the Constitution, what Abe is pushing for, is making it so that Japan has the right to exercise that right to collective self-defense, so that if the U.S., if a Japanese ship and a U.S. ship are in open waters, and if the U.S. ship comes under attack, the Japanese will be able to come to the U.S. aid and also help thwart that attack.
All right, let me carry this one step further. In a defensive posture, how does Article 9 work in terms of a preemptive defense strike against an enemy?
Well, that discussion is something that's happening within the LDP and within the Ministry of Defense about, is it constitutional for Japan to have the right to preemptively strike a missile of another country if they're ready to launch against Japan. Now, right now, that's really in the conceptual stage. There has been no firm agreement about that.
So, I mean, there is a controversy. For instance, if a North Korean missile is sitting on the launch pad and the Japanese intelligence finds out that that's going to be aimed at Tokyo, there's a question as to whether or not the Japanese could take out that missile in advance.
Correct. Right now, the discussion is essentially Japan doesn't know if that missile is going to be headed towards Tokyo. And so if Japan actually did think it was headed towards Tokyo, and they did launch a preemptive strike against that missile, but if that missile was really headed towards Seoul, then Japan, right now under current rules, Japan has just broken its constitution because it has, in effect, been an offensive attack. That was an offensive attack.
Okay. Let's go to a different issue, Jeffrey. Let's talk about the rolling severe ramifications after the Great Tohoku earthquake and the energy nuclear situation or loss of nuclear power plants that Japan finds itself in. What is Abe's plan or direction vis-a-vis restoring the energy situation so that the country's business and economy can grow.
Well, right before the Fukushima incident, there were 54 nuclear reactors in Japan. The crisis knocked out 4. So Japan currently has 50 reactors, and after the disasters, the government at the time shut down the reactors. Now, right now, 2 reactors are active. So you have 48 reactors in Japan that are not active. And so the debate is that because of this, Japan is having to import lots and lots of energy. And what Abe wants to do is restart those nuclear reactors so that Japan can be more, get back to a position of some level.
Big controversial point in Japan.
Big controversial point. It's called nuclear allergy. People don't want to see the reactors restarted. And so you do see, if you look at polls, about a third of the people in Japan support the restart. If it's a liberal newspaper or conservative newspaper, the majority of polls usually point to an opposition to restarting these reactors.
So that, we talked a little bit earlier about the challenge that Abe is going to have with this electoral tailwind that he's got,
right,
is to maintain the discipline within the party. And one of those points, we talked about is the need to clarify or revise portions or all of the Constitution, including this Article 9, and you can certainly see that to enforce the discipline, to do something serious about the energy situation if the Japanese economy is really going to grow.
Exactly. The energy situation, unless the Japanese are willing to keep importing energy sources, which with Abe's policies, right, Abenomics, it's causing the yen to depreciate, so energy prices are increasing. Unless the Japanese are willing to keep facing increased energy prices, this is not sustainable. And so when Abe looks not just at the public but at his own party, it's just because he's in charge of this party doesn't mean that the party is 100% united behind him. There are very deep divisions within his own party over all these issues: constitutional revision, nuclear energy.
What about this, Jeffrey? What about this new consumption tax that has been approved, but I don't know whether it's been implemented or not? And the talk was that this was needed to reduce the enormous public debt that Japan has.
Yeah, right.
Is that a party discipline to be able to get that consumption tax in place?
Well, that's another issue where the party's split right now. The Japan has over 200% debt to GDP, which basically means the country has a lot of debt. It's actually the most indebted country in the world right now. And the consumption tax was meant to be one attempt to try to raise government revenues to start paying down that debt. And as you said, the legislation passed for that, but it hasn't been implemented. And Abe is faced this fall with having to decide whether to actually implement it or not. And if it does implement, it would go into effect of April next year, and that's just the first step. Right now the consumption tax is 5%. If he decides to implement it, in April of next year it will increase to 8%, and then in the April of the following year it will increase to 10%. So he's essentially doubling the consumption tax in about a 1.5 year period of time.
And boy, that is going to take some party discipline to enforce that.
Not only will it take party discipline, but it has the potential of derailing Abenomics. Because right now, if you have increasing energy prices, exporters are benefiting from the lower yen, but individual consumers are not benefiting. If their tax increases on goods, their liquid incomes are going to decrease, and you're going to see the popularity of Abe potentially plummet.
And there goes Abenomics, the third arrow doesn't stick.
There goes Abenomics, and there goes potentially Abe.
Boy, very, 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 very difficult. Let's focus a little bit now on the diplomacy security area and the controversy over the Senkakus with Japan. Where do you see that going in the future?
Well, really, this disputed territory, which is called Senkaku in Japanese and Daoyu in Chinese, it's a set of islands that are in the East China Sea, and Japan and China have really been going at it since September of last year, when the government at the time, nationalized the islands. I don't see that situation going anywhere positively in the near term.
So this repeated diplomatic slaps back and forth is something that we're going to have to get used to and hope that it doesn't get out of hand.
I think if it's just diplomatic slaps, that's the best we can hope for, because you have Chinese not only Coast Guard ships, Navy ships, and fishing ships, but you also have Japanese Coast Guard and Navy ships all in the same water, including airplanes as well. And you have this mix of a lot of ships and a lot of people in very close proximity to one another. It has the potential for a serious misunderstanding or a serious a collision happening, and then a spiraling out of control that could end up in a conflict if things are not handled properly.
Jeffrey, this Senkaku dispute with Japan, good thing for Japan, bad thing for Japan? How do you see it?
Well, I think there's two ways of looking at that. Yes.
All right. Well, this is important. We'll get your answer, but we'll do it on the other side of the break. So, ladies and gentlemen, stay with us. We're talking about Abe's tailwind and the end of the twisted diet for Japan. We'll see you on the other side of the break. This is Pacific Forum's Issues and Insights. We're talking about Prime Minister Abe's electoral tailwind and the end of the twisted diet for Japan and what it means. And our special guest is Professor Jeffrey Hornung from the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. And Jeffrey, right at the break, I asked you a question, and it had to do with the Senkaku Islands, whether this was a good thing or a bad thing for Japan. And by the Senkaku Islands, I mean the dispute with China.
Right. I would answer that it's neither nor. It's actually both. You could look at it in two different ways. from the positive side, it's a good thing for Japan because it finally gives Japan the kick that they needed to really focus on security.
We call that a slap upside the head.
A slap upside the head. For many years, the Japanese defense budget has been just on a downward spiral.
Okay.
There hasn't been any serious consideration of security issues within Japan amongst the public, any serious discourse. Of course, within the government, there always has. But it finally puts security issues in perspective, and it gives Japan now a reason to not only increase the budget, which Prime Minister Abe did for the first time in 11 years, but also to strengthen some of these weak areas that Japan has had in its security side of its relationship with China.
Okay, like
Well, like for
amphibious capabilities?
amphibious capabilities, increasing anti-submarine warfare, a lot of the surveillance. But then there's the negative side, and I alluded to a part of that before, is that you have the potential here for something going horribly wrong. And so with all these ships, with all these planes in the vicinity, there's something could go wrong, and it could go really wrong. At the same time, it also has the potential of putting the U.S. as an ally in a very strange position, because the U.S. is an ally of Japan, and if something happens between Japan and China, that may not warrant a full-out conflict of some sort. The Japan could look to the U.S. and say, hey, what's going on here? And it has the potential of stressing relations if the response by the U.S. is not seen as adequate by the Japanese.
Interesting, very interesting. We have a question coming in from our studio audience here, and so let me get the caller in our studio audience. Just identify your first name, sir, if you could.
I'm Kerry, and I've got a question for Dr. Hornung. There's a very clear disdain by President Obama for Prime Minister Abe, and that has been noted in both the Japanese news media extensively and by American commentators. The Washington Post had a great column on it this morning as one example. The fact that he keeps Prime Minister Abe at arm's length for whatever political or other reasons is obvious. The fact that President Obama basically snubbed Prime Minister Abe when they were in Ireland for the Group of Eight meeting, and then Secretary of State Kerry basically snubbed his counterpart in Brunei last month as well, when they chose not to have meetings when they should have had meetings with this treaty ally of ours, the most important treaty ally, as we've said historically in Asia. Now, at compounding this very visible disdain for Prime Minister Abe is the fact that President Obama is nominating a complete novice in Asian affairs and one with zero background in Japan to be the next ambassador to Japan, Carolyn Kennedy. It all seems almost designed to alienate the government of Japan and the people of Japan from America. Is there an upside to this? Is there something that isn't obvious about the Carolyn Kennedy nomination to be the next ambassador to Japan?
Interesting question, boy.
Very interesting question, and I would argue that there is an upside. And the upside essentially is that there's two ways of looking at it. One upside is that the Kennedy name in Japan still carries a lot of weight. And so by sending a Kennedy to Japan, really amongst the Japanese public, it's going to generate a lot of goodwill. But there's also the side in that amongst the Japanese government, they know that Carolyn Kennedy has a close relationship with President Obama. And so there's this feeling that he's sending more or less a friend to Japan to be the representation of the U.S.
So that connects the Japanese government and people much closer to the administration than somebody else.
Correct. It's not seen as sort of just a State Department, someone who's had a long career, or somebody who might know a lot about Japan and think that they can just roll in and do their thing. It's somebody who is seen amongst the Japanese that has a close connection with the president, and so it could foster a little bit of goodwill there.
Jeffrey, this has been a fabulous discussion. We're almost out of time here, and I need to slip in. Give me a real short answer. Looking into the future, Abe as Prime Minister for the next 6 years, how do you see relationship between U.S. and Japan developing over this period of time? Is he going to drive us apart, bring us closer together? What do you think?
I think it depends on which Abe is going to rule for the coming years. If we see the pragmatic Abe, the guy who's concerned about the economic situation in Japan, who's negotiating the TPP, if we see that Abe, I think you're going to see U.S.-Japan relations go back to a period of really, or maintain this period of closeness. If you see the Abe that is the nationalist Abe, the one who pokes
Yasukuni Shrine visitor.
Goes to Yasukuni Shrine, makes comments about Japan's Imperial Army's role, whitewashing history. If you see that Abe, the one who pokes China and Korea in the eye, that's going to make things difficult with the U.S. because let's remember South Korea is also a treaty ally of the U.S. and it doesn't help the U.S. if Japan is angering South Korea.
Okay, I got to ask you this as the private sector business lawyer here. Trans-Pacific Partnership, free trade agreement for Asia-Pacific region. Japan now joins it. Do you think Abe can enforce sufficient discipline within his own party, including the agricultural sector, to hold that together and get Japan into that Trans-Pacific Partnership?
This is the big question. He sort of tried to pull the wool over some people's eyes by saying, I'm going to promise exclusions in tariff eliminations, and he's trying to say the rice is going to be included with that. But you look at reports coming out of Washington, and they say there's no exclusions. You join the TPP, you're in. So if Abe really cannot fulfill these sort of half promises that he can promise exclusions, I think he's going to have rough sailing.
He's got some enormous challenges, hasn't he?
He's got enormous challenges. He's got an agenda that, if you look at it, apart from constitutional revision, he's got a lot of pragmatic things that are meant to really strengthen Japan from within. But these are not easy issues. You have things like nuclear energy, TPP, that really have divisions not only in the public but within his own party. And he's got to find that sweet spot of pleasing the public as well as pleasing a majority within his party so that he can maintain a high popularity and maintain the majority within his own party to support him. And as long as he can do that, and again, that is very difficult.
Right.
As long as he can do that, he has the potential of remaining prime minister for quite a while.
He could be, if he can do what you said, he could be Japan's next Koizumi, maybe.
He could be Japan's next Koizumi in terms of length, in terms of duration. There's a lot of...
he does not have the Koizumi star charisma, though.
He doesn't have the charisma, and to be quite honest, I don't know of any politician in Japan right now that carries on the Koizumi legacy of charisma.
Well, Jeffrey, you know, this has been a wonderful conversation that we have had, and you know, on behalf of Pacific Forum, I'd like to really thank you for taking the time and coming and joining us, and I hope that as we start to roll forward and see that third arrow develop with Abenomics and some of these issues being addressed in a more substantial fashion down the road, that we'll be able to get you to come back and participate in other shows with us.
It would be my pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation today, and I look forward to coming back and having another good discussion on these issues.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to Pacific Forum's Issues and Insights. Our show has been called Abe's Tailwind and the End of the Twisted Diet for Japan. And remember that our programming is set so that one week we do a program on geopolitics and foreign policy with Pacific Forum, which is a world-class think tank based here in Honolulu, Hawaii. And it is affiliated with Jeffrey's organization, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Again, another of the, in fact, I think that center has been voted the #1 think tank in the world, hasn't it? And
I've seen that list, yes, and they're actually moving to a brand new location within Washington, moving away from K Street to a much nicer building.
Nicer than K Street, even.
Nicer than K Street.
And Jeffrey also is, of course, a very important faculty member for our own Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, which is that those low-level buildings, next time you drive by the Halikoa parking garage there. But again, thank you so much, Jeffrey, and all of you have a safe drive home, and we'll see you next week for an Asian Review show. Good night.